I'd like to start with a little definition of capitalist society. The capitalist society begins when the commodity form becomes the paradigm for social relations, when it dominates social relations. When that commodity form rules a society, it determines what people value, it structures how they live, how they relate to each other, and it defines what has any significance within the society and within the psyche of the people that are in that society. So the question of the commodity form itself is a psychic determinant. And I think that psychic impact of the commodity form hasn't received the attention that it should receive. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about today. So I don't think we've yet taken into account how this commodity form shapes and transforms how we relate to each other and how we relate to the society. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. So it's not a living creature with its own psyche, but it has a psychic impact, and it demands a certain psychic response from those who are within the society that the commodity form dominates, that it structures. So what characterizes the commodity form, I want to argue, is the promise of pure excess. That is if you strip away, if you get to the core of what the commodity form is, it is precisely this promise of pure excess, and it appears magical because it allows us to believe that we can overcome what we lack, that we can finally get beyond lack and overcome this and have an experience of excess without anything lacking at all. And every time I have an interaction with the commodity form, it's that promise of pure excess that's at work. So whether I'm buying stock in some company that seems to be exploding, or whether I'm purchasing an object that is a commodity. In each case, the commodity has this promise of pure excess. So I can, with the stock I buy, I'm going to gain absolutely. With the commodity that I purchase, I'm going to have some kind of untrammeled enjoyment that I otherwise wouldn't have access to. So capitalism seduces us with this image of pure excess. This is how it works, I think. But if we look at this image closer, then it doesn't, the purity of it dissipates. And I think that's one of the keys to the analysis of how capitalism works psychically, that it has this promise of pure excess, and then it's never as pure as all that when it works out. That there's always some hidden lack or hidden sacrifice beneath the excess, so that every excess is an impure excess, not a pure excess. So you might say that what I'm authoring or offering is a critique of pure excess in the spirit of Immanuel Kant. The central role of excess in capitalism is the result of the emphasis it places on the production of commodities, right? So capitalist society is very interesting because it clearly there's social reproduction. It reproduces itself. But it does so by placing all its emphasis on the act of production and even overproduction. So this constitutes really capitalism's incredible originality, I think, in the history of humanity. That it's the first society in which the reproduction of the society is not what's crucial. Instead, the production of an excess is what is determinative for everything that happens within that society. So it reproduces itself not by ensuring that there are mechanisms for reproducing the society, like certain social rights, etc. Instead, it places emphasis on this production of excess, and reproduction just occurs almost as a happenstance, as a secondary effect of the emphasis on production. And again, that is distinct. That's something very distinct about capitalist society. So under capitalism, production doesn't serve reproduction, but reproduction serves production. And production is always overproduction, or the production of an excess. That if I'm a good capitalist subject, I'm never just looking to produce enough. Instead, I'm looking to produce excessively. And by the same token, if I'm a good capitalist subject as a consumer, I'm never just looking to consume enough. I want to consume excessively. So if I need one pair of shoes, my desire is to consume 100 pairs of shoes, right? So that excess, like I need the newest kind of Nike tennis shoe, not just the one that happens to work just fine for playing tennis or doing what other kind of athletic activity I'm doing. So that's I think really important. So this overproduction of excess as what is useless is really the lifeblood of capitalism. So capitalism relies not on catering to everything we need, giving us what's useful. Instead, and I think this is really the key point, it's the production of an excess that's not useful that keeps capitalism going, that keeps it expanding and keeps it functioning as a socioeconomic system and as a psychic system too. So this emphasis on production as the means of reproduction definitively, I want to argue, separates capitalist society from all hitherto existing societies. So previous social forms, whatever their stripe, they devoted their primary energy to reproducing themselves because that's what they thought was difficult. So let's have enough food to reproduce ourselves. Let's have enough children to reproduce ourselves as a society. Let's educate people in the ways of our society so that it can carry on. Capitalism doesn't care about that. So even education under capitalism is done for the sake of producing more, not for the sake of reproducing the society. So everything gets flipped around in this relationship between production and reproduction. And I think this is a result of the dominance of the commodity form in capitalist society. So what was useless had a role, obviously, in former societies, but it was confined to a specific place, like a religious ceremony. Like that's the useless, is confined to the religious or some kind of social rite. But under capitalism, it all of a sudden gets center stage. This is totally fascinating shift. And as a result, reproduction just occurs incidentally. So you're not, as a capitalist, you're not concerned about either reproducing yourself, surviving, that's not the primary concern, or reproducing the society, keeping things going as they are. Instead, things go as they are because of the emphasis placed on overproduction or production of excess, production of the useless. So even though capitalism is oriented around the future accumulation of capital, it's actually even more future-oriented than any other society, but it doesn't leave anyone in charge of making sure the future is going to be okay. And so this focus on production instead of reproduction has really profound effects in capitalist society. And the number one thing, I think, it's the core of why, the core reason why we're currently in a terrible climate crisis, right? Because survival, keeping the planet habitable, is just not a good that capitalism is interested in as a system. So a capitalist might read Charles Darwin and say, okay, I can accept this idea of the survival of the fittest, but there's no way in which the capitalist can ever make a natural selection. That is to say that you can't ever choose just to satisfy some kind of natural need. Instead, you have to create something useless that people desire that's excessive, right? In order to be successful as a capitalist. The capitalism demands excessive choices that go beyond the requirements of mere survival. So in this sense, I think the fact that capitalism is now a threat to destroy the habitability of the planet shouldn't really shock us at all. In fact, it follows logically from the structure of capitalism because it reproduces itself only through the production of a surplus. So there's always going to be more and more and more, and there's going to be more of gases that make the planet heat up and make it eventually uninhabitable. So I think that's that stems from the radicality of the capitalist break from other social forms. And I think that's one of that within capitalism, surplus production is what is the absolute key. And so it can't be surprising that we now are suffocating on a surplus, because there's always too much in capitalist society, including too much of greenhouse gases, right? So this attempt to ensure the reproduction of the social order by paying attention to the destruction of the planet always is going to run aground on capitalism's need for excessive productivity. And so there's never going to be this green capitalism that successfully limits our overproductivity, because the overproductivity, the production of excess, of useless excess, is absolutely essential to capitalism's success as a system and its continued existence as a system. It just exists if things are if it's just reproducing itself without introducing something excessive into that reproduction. In other words, some kind of excessive, useless addition always has to be included within the capitalist system for it to work. So capitalism stands out as a system because it doesn't simply produce enough for people to survive. And that's why there can be no capitalist fixes to the climate disaster. I want to argue that instead it threatens existence itself, because existence isn't really a value within capitalist society. So survival is just a secondary effect. It's a happenstance. What's more important is creating and accumulating a surplus. It's more important than if I survive to have the surplus. No, what's more important is the production or the consumption of the surplus. This is why we can't, the ecological activist who tries to change our emphasis to sustainability is never going to be successful under the capitalist regime, because it is inherently the very health of the regime depends upon the unsustainability. That is the production of something excessive that doesn't just allow things to keep on going in a stable way. So stability is an enemy of the capitalist system, or it's just impossible, which is why there's no kind of rapprochement between the call for limiting production in the name of social reproduction, which is the ecological claim, and the imperative that drives capitalist overproduction, which is what capitalist production, capitalist overproduction are basically just the same thing, because all capitalist production is capitalist overproduction. So the point is not that, terrible capitalist society makes us all egoistical, and thus we can't think about the larger concerns of the larger collective or of the natural world, etc. No, it's not the point at all. The point is that the destruction of the earth continues in the way that it's going because capitalism doesn't consider the good at all. So it's not just like I'm concerned with my good to the exclusion of other people's good. No, it's the good is out of the equation. And so the good of a healthy planet, the good of a habitable world, these are not goods for capitalism because there is no good at all. So this turn away from the good, a move to sacrifice the good for the sake of unrestrained excessiveness, defines the capitalist epoch and defines the capitalist system. So the point of capitalist society is not sustaining things as they are, but constantly acquiring more than what one already has. That's what keeps one active and successful as a capitalist. So the capitalist creates value not by fulfilling needs, but by stimulating this desire for ever more. So you can't just fulfill the need for one pair of shoes. You got to stimulate the desire for tens or hundreds of them, right? And so the only value in capitalist society comes from producing and consuming a surplus, not just in sufficiency. So being sufficient, having enough, these are not ways you cannot operate within the capitalist system in this way. I mean, you can be a kind of marginal figure within the system, but you're not going to be a driving force in the capitalist system if that's your focus, is just creating enough for people. So there's a social imperative to accumulate more, so more money, more commodities, more enjoyment. And there's also a social imperative to consume more, to have, again, more commodities, more enjoyment, more wealth, right? And this social imperative is essential to the structure of capital society because the society runs on the production and consumption of a surplus. So the indifference to social reproduction, which is, again, fascinating because it's hard to imagine a society, and if we didn't live in it, it would be hard to imagine, in which reproduction doesn't count, but production or overproduction does, right? So it seems almost counterintuitive that a society could develop that way, but that's what has happened. So one is a capitalist subject insofar as one devotes oneself to this project of being excessive. Again, it can be either excessive in production or it can be excessive in consumption. It doesn't really matter because both are needed in the capitalist society and both stem from this fundamental capitalist imperative. So excess is what inheres in the commodity form, that this commodity form promises more and more, and it actually has the effect of infecting or contaminating our understanding of what's enjoyable for us, of how we enjoy ourselves. So we identify enjoyment with the attainment of a pure excess, an excess, again, unaffected by anything lacking. It's just purely, I didn't have to sacrifice for it, I just get it. So I invest money in, say, some Amazon stock, and then I get a surplus out of that. It didn't cost me anything, right? It just, boom, magic. I got more, now have more money. So this future, the idea of a future of unlimited enjoyment is what drives the capitalist subject. Again, that's the capitalist imperative to enjoy a pure excess, which is why, interestingly, I think that the richest people in the world, say Elon Musk, Bill Gates, figures like this, they don't stop accumulating once they have an excess beyond what they could ever think about using, right? Or even giving away, or even giving to their great-great-great-grandchildren. None of that. I mean, it's so beyond that, right? But it doesn't stop them from accumulating. They still feel like, I don't quite have enough, right? Like that's still the idea driving them, because the point is, in the logic of the capitalist system, to leave money on the table or to turn away from accumulation has the effect of violating the imperative that dominates capitalist life. And it actually calls the entire capitalist enterprise into question. So there's a way in which psychically it's not even available for those people invested in the structure of the system to opt not to accumulate as excessively as possible when there's a chance to do so. Like, why not? Like, if you could make at your job, this is lower level than Elon Musk, of course, but if you could go from a job making 100,000 to 150,000, you just do it, right? There's the other questions, like they're not relevant in terms of this imperative that dominates capitalist society. So one must always get the maximum that one can. And this imperative to accumulate is interesting because it dominates so much that it's very difficult for us to imagine we always think something else is up. If someone just turned down a pay raise, I don't need it actually. And I just don't need that raise. Sorry. Or they turn down an investment opportunity. Like, here, I'm presenting you with this great opportunity. There's no risk. You're just going to make a ton of money. No thanks. Like, that just seems like an act of a crazy person to us. And I think that's because we so live under to say one has enough violates that imperative that so dictates and determines our existence, right? So underlying this is the idea that the limit is utterly antithetical to the structure of capitalism. That it sees a limit not as something that's absolute, it cannot go beyond, but instead a limit is just an invitation to transgress it and go beyond. This is why laws are so frequently violated by corporations, right? Because they see the law not as a limit that's just absolute, you can't break the law, but instead something that's just kind of, we got to find a way to get at least around it, but beyond it in some way, right? And so that is again, this dominance of this imperative to consume excessively, to produce and consume excessively, and to accumulate to excess. So all transactions within capitalist society occur under the auspices of this fantasy of pure excess. I'm going to somehow get, finally, if I accumulate enough, I'll get to the point of pure excess, which would be a pure state of enjoyment without anything lacking at all. So when societies focus on reproducing themselves instead of production, like capitalism, they confine excess to little rituals. But in capitalism, all of a sudden, excess is not confined to a ritual. It gets free reign within the whole society. So whereas before, rituals of excess, again, like religious rituals, things like that, they were excessive. Like there could be human sacrifice, there could be sacrifice of a useful animal, etc. But that excess had its place. Under capitalism, excess just goes everywhere. There's no limit to it. So this focus on a useless excess is the result of installing the collective installation of the commodity form as the fundamental logic of the social order. And that's what happens in capitalist society. And this commodity form is the promise of infinite accumulation, infinite enjoyment, enjoyment with no limit. So it's this commodity form is the absolute refusal of the limit. It allows us to go like Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond, right? That's what the commodity form promises us. It doesn't deliver on the promise, but at least it promises us. And so at any point, as I'm going along experiencing my lack, I still have operative for me this fantasy of pure excess, again, not affected by lack. And this logic of the commodity form, this logic of pure excess has a real deleterious effect, I think, on our ability to recognize how we do enjoy. Because the fact is that our enjoyment actually has to involve lack. And if it doesn't, then we're not going to find anything enjoyable about it. So the commodity form is itself the fundamental barrier to recognizing the structure of our enjoyment and the way that our enjoyment involves what we're lacking, right? So if I enjoy a nice song on the radio, the fact that I can't enjoy it constantly is integral to my enjoyment of it. And then once I find that I can just play it on YouTube again and again and again, eventually the song becomes tedious and it's no longer enjoyable, right? So that's just a pretty banal example of the way in which you need some kind of lack to make anything at all enjoyable. Even sexual activity, right? Like if you were capable of doing it, if you have sexual activity 24 hours a day, it would cease to be enjoyable, become as tedious as working a job in a factory, right? Or it would be like working in a factory, actually. So capitalism has to hold out this promise of having it all, of enjoying without lacking anything. And you might say that the logic of capitalism is like having a new puppy that it just frolics in the park all the time, plays catch with you, but you never have to walk it, right? You never have to do all that. You don't have to pick up the feces with the little bag. You don't do any of those things. That's what capitalism promises. So it's a nice dog without the bad parts. So this ideal of non-lacking, non-castrated enjoyment is the capitalist ideal, and it's operative. This is what I think is really interesting. It's operative in every moment of capitalist production and capitalist exchange. So even when you go down to the hardware store to buy some hammer and nails, you don't think like, oh, I'm going to get the ultimate enjoyment from the hammer and the nails, but it's still operative in the background, right? So that's the thing. That's why you never get out of it when you're within capitalist relations. And the problem is that it mistakes how we enjoy, that there's no enjoyment we don't actually suffer. We have to suffer our enjoyment. Like that is, to enjoy the song, you have to have the not having the song. That suffering, not having the song all the time, is what allows you to enjoy hearing the song sometimes. Right? So that is absolutely crucial to the logic of enjoyment. And again, so capitalism sort of blinds us to that. And so this inability to see what enjoyment is the great defect of capitalism. But I want to say something really in its favor, I think. That one of the things capitalism exposes and shows us is that enjoyment is tied to excess. And I think in prior epochs, there wasn't the same sense of that we enjoy what is excessive. And that becomes, I think, clear within capital society. But then when we get this conception of enjoyment that rejects all limits for the sake of the infinite, of the pure excess, then we lose out on the possibility of enjoyment that first becomes possible in modernity. So modernity shows us the way in which the excess and not what's good for us is what's enjoyable, but then capitalism covers that over. It blinds us to it. So if we fall for the promise of more, we're unable to enjoy deciding on less, right? Which is the essence of enjoyment, not just another kind of enjoyment. This is enjoyment, is this decision for less, this decision to limit oneself, decision to lack in a certain way. So in the name, you might say, in the name of a perfect enjoyment, capitalism turns away from this possibility of valuing enjoyment and recognizing its relationship to lack that modernity makes possible. So even though there's a sense in which capitalism and modernity are coextensive, there's also a sense in which I think this is, to me, really important, that capitalism betrays this possibility opened up by modernity. I think it's really, really crucial. So the challenge of modernity, I think, is liberating enjoyment from the strictures of the commodity form. And I think Karl Marx, in his analysis of the commodity, especially in the first chapter of Das Kapital, Volume 1, really starts us down this path and makes even this, what I'm saying to you, possible, right? Like if he didn't have that analysis, this wouldn't be possible. So enjoyment is not just a practice, although it is that. It's also a theoretical struggle. And as long as we think of enjoyment as this ability to act without limits, to act in any way we want, totally excessively, then we miss the possibility of emancipating ourselves from the commodity form and from the dictates, the imperatives of capitalist society. So capitalism, the problem is that it doesn't allow us to see this enjoyment as an effect of lack, right? The enjoyment through lack. And I think that's the shift we need to make. And we can see an instance of this, how this enjoyment through lack works in the case of art, right? So art is what the artist does is use self-imposed limits to create some form of excess in terms of aesthetic enjoyment. So the constraints, for instance, of poetic meter create the possibility of the beautiful poem. They're not just constraints that are just limiting, right? They're also a limit. They are a limit that produces this possibility of incredible excess, right? And that is for capitalism. It's anathema, and that's why there's of course the art market. Capitalism uses art as a new form of money, etc. But there's a way in which art and capitalism are antithetical, because art is this embrace of the fecundity of the limit, and capitalism is this allergy to the limit. So artistic creativity works through this self-imposed limit, which is precisely what the commodity form cannot tolerate. So in this sense, again, artistic form, art as a form, as a formal structure, is the antipode of the commodity. as a form. So we have artistic form, commodity form. They're at odds with each other because the artistic form uses and creates a productive limit, and the commodity form evinces a total disdain for the limit. And so the artist never allows us an unalloyed, pure enjoyment, a pure excess, even though art is the domain of excess, but it's always a limiting or a limited excess. And I think that's absolutely crucial. Whereas in contrast, the paradigm of desire that keeps capitalism going is this constant yearning for more. So you have to desire more wealth, more commodities, etc., in order to keep the capitalist structure going. And so if you don't do that, this disregard of the good, if you don't accept that, you're not doing your part as a capitalist subject. You're not fitting within the capitalist society. So this fundamental shift ends up that capitalism brings about from other kinds of societies, from reproduction to production, from focus on the good to focus on excess. It doesn't just involve money. Instead, it involves the total change of the social structure. So there is no, in capitalism, there is no longer a good that is dominant. Instead, and I think this separates it from every other society, which even though the good might have been, and always maybe, is illusory, is never reached, it nonetheless is the organizing principle of the society, and in capitalism that's no longer true. And I think that really is the revolutionary change that it inaugurates. And I think we can see this change, I think, really nicely in a joke about an investment banker. So this banker drives to his office in New York City and opens the door of his new BMW just as a taxi speeds by and knocks the door off his car. And the irate banker immediately pulls out his cell phone. He calls the police to report the incident. And the police arrive on the scene, and he demands that they apprehend the cab driver who had the temerity to damage his pristine new car. And the police look at him perplexed, and he's ranting, and they're just looking at him perplexed. And they don't inquire about the culprit. They don't ask any questions. And he goes berserk. He starts screaming at them. He's like, "You don't really appreciate what's happened here." And he goes, "You don't realize what I've lost." And finally, one of the officers tells the banker, he's like, "Look, I think you have bigger problems than your missing car door." And he points down at the banker's missing left arm. And then the banker says, "Oh my God, I lost my Rolex too." So the point of this joke, what I think is pretty funny, is that the banker's bodily integrity means less to him than the commodity, both the BMW and the Rolex, right? And I think this is a joke that we in capitalist society find really fun. At least I find it really, really funny. But what's really interesting, I think, is someone who was not living in capitalist society under its logic would just think it was like, that was dumb. Like, you can imagine Plato or Aristotle listening to this joke going, "Yeah, I don't get it. Like, why is that funny? Who would do that?" No one would do that. Everyone would be worried about their arm, right? So, or would even notice the arm first, not the missing car door. So they couldn't imagine a society that privileged this excess of enjoyment over the good. And again, this is what the fact that we identify with the banker is what makes us capitalist subjects. So everyone can at least if you wouldn't have acted that way, of course, it's an exaggerated response, but we can still see why the banker acted like this. And this turn from the good to the excess of enjoyment as the basis for the social order is one that I think you couldn't have anticipated it prior to capitalism, and you couldn't even have made sense of it. Again, so people like someone like Aristotle, who says every human society strives for the good, that the good is the structuring principle, that's just no longer true. And it wouldn't make sense. And thus, I think capitalist society simply wouldn't make sense to him because the good is so marginalized in favor of excessive production. So there's under capitalism, there's a modern capitalist regime of enjoyment that replaces the traditional regime of the good. Again, the good is not gone, but it's always sacrificed for the sake of a production of an excess that we can enjoy. And so this is why I enjoy all the time acting against my own good and not working to sustain my life as it is, not working to reproduce myself. This is what gives the thrill of enjoyment to things like illicit drugs, skydiving, motorcycle riding, engaging in anonymous, unprotected sex, all these things, right? In each case, I put my own welfare at stake, which opens the door to enjoyment. So enjoyment is always wasteful. It always stems from what's not necessary, what's not good for me. It goes beyond this requirement for what's required for reproduction, and even goes beyond pleasure, right? So every society produces this wasteful enjoyment, but it's only capitalist society that makes this wasteful, excessive, useless enjoyment its foundational principle or even its lifeblood. And I think what it does, though, what's interesting is that enjoyment itself doesn't change under capitalism. So it lets us see the importance of enjoyment. There's a genuine insight there that enjoyment is what makes life worth living. The failed insight is the idea that enjoyment can be pure, can be divorced from all lack. And that's where I think capitalism goes astray. So the way in which capitalism has taken excess as its fundamental principle, fine. But it has failed to see the way in which that excess is tied to something lacking. And I think without that recognition, we remain stuck in a series of horrible catastrophes that we can't work our way out of. So unlike in traditional societies, in capitalist society, success just means it is tied to more, right? So it's only if one gets more that one is doing your social duty. And as a result, there's an incredible production of waste and more waste than we know what to do with. Again, that's just a natural result of this logic, this imperative of capitalist society to achieve a kind of pure excess. And again, what contributes to the good in capitalist society is not the source of value. So this is why homelessness is such a crisis under capitalism, because the good of dwelling for everyone it's not a factor. That's not what matters. What matters is excessive production of living space, right? So produce a lot of mansions, but don't produce enough affordable housing for everyone, right? Like that's a typical, I think, way in which capitalist society functions. And again, it just follows from this logic of the striving toward the pure excess and this imperative to produce and consume excessively. So both the production of mansions and the consumption of them is driven and operates under this same imperative. So the good of dwelling is absolutely secondary to the excess of enjoyment tied to the mansion, right? So there's the good just doesn't matter. And this is what, again, in a way, in a fundamental way, this is the insight of capitalist society, that the good is secondary to enjoyment, but it doesn't make the next step to see the way in which enjoyment has to be tied to lack in the way that art does. So I think that this contrast between capitalism and art is really instructive. Capitalism's devotion to the production and enjoyment of excess opens up the possibility of equal access to enjoyment, which I think is the radical possibility of modernity, and that I don't think any other society really creates this opening. So the unleashing of excess ties capitalism to the emergence of equality as a genuine possibility for the first time, I think. This possibility inheres in capitalist modernity, but then so does its betrayal. The enjoyment of excess emerges out of the subject of lack In other words, we can be excessive only to the extent that we are lacking. Lack is what creates excessiveness. And even though capitalism tells us that the commodity generates its own excess, we shouldn't be too credulous about this, because it's always some act of sacrifice that gives the commodity the value that it has. The sacrifice that Marx recounts of the laborer sacrificing surplus labor time to create the surplus value that inheres in the commodity. So it's not a magic act. It's actually an act of sacrifice. Similarly, on the part of the consumer, this is why what we pay for has value to us, because we sacrifice money for it. So the limit, the sacrifice is integral to the enjoyment of the thing. And we can't enjoy the unlimited, we cannot enjoy. But it's this refusal to link lack to excess that drives the production of so much wasteful, useless excess, and that also makes capitalist society a profoundly unequal one. If one sees and seeks pure excess, then one has to discard a commodity almost as soon as one has it, and one also needs someone else to be the bearer of lack, right? So you're thinking as a capitalist subject, I need someone else to bear lack so that I can be the figure of pure excess. This is this necessary inegalitarian structure that capitalism has. So insisting on pure excess leads to inequality because it forces someone else to silently sacrifice for the sake of my pure excess. But no matter how much the other is sacrificing, I'm never getting the purity of excess that capitalism promises, right? So no matter, there is no figure of pure excess within the capitalist universe or anywhere, precisely because lack is the vehicle for excess, that the limit is what we enjoy, not the unlimited. And I think, contrary to what the commodity tells us, we can't attain excess through the object that we accumulate. Instead, excess emerges as a possibility through loss, not through acquisition. And this is a thing I think that we need to really try to come to terms with. That it's why the things that we've lost harbor so much more enjoyment for us than what we have, right? Or the thing that we're trying to get seems to have a kind of enjoyment attached to it that what we already have doesn't have, right? And so that's the structure of our enjoyment, that loss is inherent to it, not something that we overcome to get it, right? So that's the dynamic. So because it overcomes and because it goes beyond the realm of the good, enjoyment depends on what it gives up, right? So the realm of the good is a realm of you just obtain, you get what you need. Whereas enjoyment is an attempt to transcend, or it is what transcends just the bare good. And that's why it requires this act of sacrifice to get to it. We give something up in order to assert the value of what we want to enjoy. And I think it's true even in the case of the commodity, that what we pay for it is what gives it its value, that the more we pay for a commodity, the more we value it, right? And that's, I think, in a certain way, you're paying for the commodity just to pay for the commodity, because that's what that sacrifice of all that money is part of what you enjoy as you're consuming or having the commodity. And I think this is not a commodity, but I think we can see it clearest in the case of skydiving, because skydiving, it's completely useless, right? There's no social utility attached to skydiving. So we can think of other, or even personal utility, right? So we can think of other activities, kind of sporting activities that have social utility, like playing golf, playing pickleball, playing squash. You play and you make business or social connections, right? There are other activities that keep you physically fit, like tennis, basketball, running, weightlifting. That's why we do them. Skydiving doesn't fall into either of these categories. It's useless. It doesn't give you don't get a good workout by skydiving, and no one in human history has made a good business contact by skydiving, right? Because people who are good in business tend not to skydive. But even if they did, that's not where you make the connections. But what skydiving does, because of its uselessness, is put us at risk. Like there's a clear sense of loss attached to skydiving. That is loss of some of my chance of survival. Not much, of course, it's pretty safe. And we do all these things to assure us that it's safe. We have a backup chute packed by a professional, etc. But nonetheless, there's still some risk that I'm not going to survive the act of skydiving, some additional risk of death that I wouldn't have if I didn't go skydiving, right? And so that is essential, that and the uselessness is essential to the excessive enjoyment attached to skydiving. And I think what's nice, there's all the jokes about skydiving that they almost make themselves because they're all about the way in which death is integral to the process and integral to the enjoyment of it. For instance, there's a joke that goes, you don't need a parachute to go skydiving. You only need a parachute to go skydiving twice. And then there's another related joke to that says, I was skydiving the other day, my parachute malfunctioned, but luckily I had the rest of my life to fix it. Right, so in both cases, the jokes are funny because they hit on what makes skydiving an enjoyable enterprise. The fact that you might die doing it, the fact that there is loss actually integrated into the excess of skydiving. Skydiving is not pure excess. It's excess where loss is foregrounded. So in that way, skydiving is such a nice example because it gives the lie to this capitalist fantasy of pure excess. And the skydiving joke exposes it, I think, best of all. That it shows us that this accumulative imperative, this imperative of attaining pure excess in capitalism doesn't work. That we need lack in order to actually have any excess, so that any excess is actually going to be impure rather than pure. Now, capitalist society is structured around this useless excess, but it doesn't let us see, which I think that is how society is structured. That's, in that sense, it's not a lie, but it doesn't let us see that this useless excess is necessarily an impure excess. That is it's not just excess without any lack attached to it. And that's why none of capitalism's excesses can avow precisely how they produce enjoyment, right? The commodity always obscures its seedy, lacking underside. And so my claim here is that the promise of capitalism is that the excess of the commodity can cure us of our lack, that in the future we'll attain what's promised by the commodity form and no longer be lacking subjects. But this is the basic capitalist deception. And there's the drive of capitalism to seek this pure excess is a drive that it's a seeking that we'll never find. And instead of doing that, I think we need to find the lacking excess that we already have rather than seeking it out somewhere out in the future. So capitalism, I think, lives on an enjoyment that it doesn't allow us to understand correctly. And I think theorizing how that enjoyment works is part of the way in which we challenge its dominance in the capitalist world. That to make clear the role that lack has within capitalist excess, to make clear the impurity of the excess that the commodity form promises, I think is the way that we move away from and out of the damage of the capitalist epoch. So the revolution that capitalism inaugurates away from the good is an emancipatory one. Capitalist modernity enables us to see the priority that enjoyment has in our lives relative to the good. So we can see that the value of the good lies only in its basis in enjoyment, that the only point of the good is to sacrifice it for our enjoyment. And that's what capitalism or capitalist modernity shows us. So modernity frees us to enjoy what we lack rather than to pursue the good. But to arrive at this point, we have to toss aside capitalism's demand for more. So the challenge, I think, is to create a modernity without capitalism. That is, a society that privileges excess over the good, but recognizes that the enjoyment of excess has to depend upon lack. Whereas the fantasy of a pure excess always separates those who have from those who have not, so that those who have can imagine themselves as purely excessive subjects. Recognizing the bond between lack and excess is inherently egalitarian. So it marks a step outside the logic of the commodity form and this demand for pure excess. And I think there can be equality only when we stop submitting to the dominance of the commodity form.